The Pastoral Epistles. In this introduction to the Pastoral Epistles, I want to cover issues of authorship, audience, date, and purpose, and then move on to some of the content of what we find in these letters of Paul to Timothy and Titus. So first of all, with respect to authorship, it's probably widely known that many scholars have disputed whether or not Paul wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. This dispute, as is often the case, is on the issue of language and style, and then also on what one actually reads there. Is it consistent with what we read elsewhere in Paul? And here we're not only talking about theology, but we're also talking about issues of how the church is established. Paul in the 1 Timothy and in Titus talks about these what we might call church leaders, episkopoi, presbyteroi, and diakonoi. And the question is, what are these? Are they really church leaders, or in what sense are they church leaders? And does Paul have a concept at all of leadership? Many people have looked at a passage like 1 Corinthians chapter 12, which talks about different gifting in the church, and everybody contributes a certain gift. And then also Romans 12, everybody contributes a certain gift. So with this kind of charismatic structure of the church, do we not have something quite different from what we read in the pastoral epistles? Now, it's also worth noting at this point that the letter of Ephesians talks about different functions that certain people play in the church that help the church to grow up into the head, which is Christ. The passage I have in mind is in Ephesians 4, and there we hear about apostles, we hear about what might be translated as evangelists. Well, it's first of all apostles, prophets, then evangelists, but evangelists could be people who proclaim the gospel, pure and simple, not any other sense of evangelist or traveling evangelist or something like that. And then he mentions pastors and teachers, which seems to be a related role, the way the Greek works there. Is that how separate are those two functions, pastors and teachers? So we either have like 4 or 5 different groupings, and they do play a rather significant role in the church. What do we have here? We have different language. We have episkopoi, which can be translated as overseers. The NRSV translates that word as bishops, which gives us a very different idea of what's going on here. He's talking about the local church having bishops. That's probably a very poor translation if all of us are thinking of a bishop as someone who's the head over several churches in a certain area. Then he uses the word presbyteroi, which is the word from which we get our word presbyter. And presbyteroi really means simply elders. It's a role that was found in the synagogue, the elders among the men of the synagogue. And then we have the word diakonoi, which means ones who serve, and that's where we get our word deacon from. Diakonos is deacon, one who serves. Now, in the early part of the book of Acts, people are appointed for service. The word isn't used in the noun. So is that the same as what we have here? And where should we understand the development of the role of diakonoi as we progress through the first century with the early church? Now, this is a term that's used for Phoebe in Romans 16, and so we should be careful about saying it's non-Pauline. The book of Acts talks about presbyteroi, elders that are established in the church by Paul and by Barnabas during the right at the end of the first missionary journey before they leave southern Galatia. So some scholars have said, no, that's Luke reading back into Acts from a later time, this role of elders. But obviously the other way to look at it is that there is this kind of role right from the start of elders and deacons in the church. There may be developing language around this, like the addition of the word episkopoi, or it just might be that that word wasn't used in the literature that we have. Well, that's the big question. Is what we read of the church in passages like 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 compatible with this idea of presbyters, elders, deacons, and overseers in the local church? One thing to note is that as we read the pastoral epistles, it doesn't seem as if episkopoi is a separate term from presbyteroi, but rather they might be the same term, or else presbyteroi, elders, could refer either to the overseers or to the deacons. But we don't have three different groups of people. We have really two different groups of people, as we find in 1 Timothy chapter 3. We have episkopoi and diakonoi, and presbyteroi in that passage simply aren't mentioned. And when we have episkopoi and presbyteroi mentioned in Titus chapter 1, it seems as if they're interchangeable terms rather than two different groups. Okay, so that's a quick way of going over one of the big issues that's discussed. The big issue of what is the nature of church leaders, church officials, and we're going to come back to this question a little bit later on. But in terms of authorship, the question is what we read about these people in the pastoral epistles compatible with what we read elsewhere in Paul? A third kind of issue that's raised is what is said about women in the role of teaching. Has Paul really got such a view on women that it's compatible with what we read in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15? And then other issues on teaching too. What is taught in the pastoral epistles, it's questioned at times whether Paul would have said exactly that in the same way. There are levels of comparison. It's not simply that what you read in the pastoral epistles contradicts something in the other epistles, but rather it seems like things are said slightly differently. Teaching is presented slightly differently. And then the language for that is presented slightly differently. Now, all the answers to that kind of a question of authorship that we've looked at in earlier lectures could be applied here. A different author, a different time period, a different way of writing when he's writing directly to someone like Timothy or Titus. We could explain these things in different ways. We can acknowledge differences, but does that push us over the edge and say, Paul couldn't possibly have written this? Now, another question on authorship isn't this nagging question of whether Paul wrote this, but where is Paul supposed to be, no matter who wrote it? And there's going to be a map in the next slide where we can look at this. But in 1 Timothy, Paul has traveled from Ephesus to Macedonia. And no matter how your English translation reads, it's possible he's still in Macedonia, or it's possible that he's moved on, because what Paul's point is in 1 Timothy 1:3 is that I told you to stay in Ephesus, he says to Timothy, when I was taking my trip from Ephesus to Macedonia. We just don't know if he's still in Macedonia. Now, Titus seems to be written at the same time, and Paul is headed to Nicopolis in Macedonia. We'll see that on the map on the next slide, according to chapter 3, verse 12. 2 Timothy is the last letter, and it has Paul now in prison in Rome, and we're going to argue that the more likely way of construing this is that he's in prison in Rome for a second time now, and he's facing death. Chapter 1, verse 17. Right, now here's the map, and we see rather boldly Macedonia and Achaia. About halfway between those two bold words in black, on the left side, we see Nicopolis. This is where Paul tells Titus to meet him. Now, Titus is in Crete. On this map, it's called Creta, and it is right at the bottom, the island right at the bottom of the map. Ephesus is there. You should know where that is by now, over on the right side of the screen and on the western side of Asia. Well, the audience is personal. It's Timothy and it's Titus. Now, what is said in 1 Timothy could easily be construed as a letter that is written for the church, reading over the shoulder of Timothy. In other words, it might be a letter directed personally to Timothy, but really intended for the whole church. And of course, that's how we receive it. We read 1 Timothy not as some purely private correspondence, but a correspondence for the church. 2 Timothy really doesn't seem to have any other audience than Timothy in mind, though. And yet we get this very intensely personal word from Paul to Timothy when Paul is facing his own death. It's an amazing piece of correspondence that we have. And in it we see Paul's hope and Paul's resolve, and yet Paul's agony and pain. Titus is sort of a combination of 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, in the sense that at some points you could see the church reading over the shoulder of Titus as well in Crete, but the kinds of things Paul says about the Cretans are so strong that you could only assume that it would be offensive if they actually did read over the shoulder of Titus. So that's a bit of an enigma to me. Now, that's the date, the time of writing. We come up against the question of whether or not Paul was in prison twice in Rome. The book of Acts ends with Paul in prison for 2 years in Rome. And that we can date fairly straightforwardly to the years about 60 to 62 AD. If Paul was put to death at that time, so his death then would be in AD 62. If Paul was released from prison, he would have had a couple years perhaps of freedom. In AD 64, Nero persecutes Christians in Rome for accusing them of setting fire to Rome and burning a number of the precincts of Rome to the ground. Now, it's alleged by some Roman historians that Christians were made the scapegoat of a plan that was actually Nero's all along. Nero wanting to create space to rebuild to his own glory in Rome. But the date is AD 64. in view there. And according to some tradition, it seems that Paul possibly was put to death in AD 64. Now, it may be that he was put to death at a later time during Nero's reign, and some tradition isn't clear about when, but it does state that Paul is put to death during Nero's reign. Nero dies in AD 68, so that would be the last possible date to see Paul, and for that matter also Peter, put to death in Rome under the time in the time of Nero. So if Paul had some freedom after a first imprisonment in Rome, then he could have traveled to places like Nicopolis and back to Macedonia again and written 1 Timothy and Titus, and possibly also even correspondence like Colossians and Ephesians, although we've already suggested that that might be pre-AD 60. But there's possibility that some of the letters that we have of Paul come from the 60s. The one thing that we do have a fairly certain date on is that 2 Timothy is written just before Paul is put to death, although we just don't know the year of that in the 60s. Now, in the book of Acts, we have the story in Acts chapter 24, verses 4 through 6, where an accusation is made against Paul after his arrest in Jerusalem by the high priest Ananias. Acts 24, 4 to 6 reads this way: "But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness," Ananias says to the Roman procurator. "We have in fact found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and so we seized him." The question then is, what is the charge against Paul? And the charge that's leveled against Paul is a charge that sounds like it might be a charge that has to do with Jewish law. He has profaned the temple, and so we seized him. But there's also the element in this charge by Ananias that Paul is a pestilent fellow, agitating among all the Jews throughout the world. And so that raises the question of whether or not the Romans would see the charge against Paul as something that Roman law should deal with, or as Gallio suggested, it's purely a Jewish issue. Now, as we read through the book of Acts, we see that Luke is answering the charge against Paul as we proceed. It's possible that some of the material that Luke uses is actually from Paul's trial. In 2 Timothy, we realize that only Luke is with Paul at the time of his trial and leading up to his death. And so this may well be what Luke is doing. He's heard the trial. He's watched the evidence written up and presented, and he's worked that into the book of Acts. So, for example, in Acts 13:7, we read that Sergius Paulus in Cyprus was impressed by Paul. And in Acts 16:20 to 21, Paul and Silas have been arrested and accused, and they are accused of disturbing our city. They are Jews advocating customs not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe. So it was an accusation from Roman citizens about their Jewishness. And then what happened was they were beaten and thrown in prison, but then there was a public apology by the magistrates to Paul and Silas once they realized that they were Roman citizens Again, separating out what happens with Romans and what happens with Jews. Then in Corinth, certain Jews lodge an official complaint against Paul before Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. They say in Acts 18, verse 13, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." And then Gallio decides the matter and says this is just a matter of Jewish law. It has nothing to do with Roman law, and he ignores the complaint. In Ephesus, Paul's third missionary journey, Paul is accused by Demetrius of drawing a number of people away from the worship of Artemis, and so also affecting the trade in idols. Acts 19, 25 through 27. Here's another charge against Paul. The actual arrest of Paul in Jerusalem is represented by Luke as based on an extremely weak case then before Roman officials. Luke emphasizes that Paul is a Roman citizen, chapter 22, which would mean that he would be subject to Roman law over Jewish law. Since the accusation against him is a Jewish matter, it is difficult to imagine that Caesar would side with the Jews in the case of Paul. The tribune in Jerusalem wrote a letter exonerating Paul, Acts 23, verse 29. And Paul defends himself before Festus with these words in Acts 25, verse 8. Paul said in his defense, "I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews, or against the temple," so that's the Jewish side, "or against the emperor," that's the Roman side. He's arguing that he is not an agitator. He is not. He should not be considered offensive to either group. And then Festus and Herod Agrippa hear Paul, and both agree that Paul should not be imprisoned, and had he not appealed to Caesar. What about the purpose of these letters? They're written in order to strengthen members of Paul's missionary team in their ministry. They're an excellent study for people who are interested in what might be said to young ministers about what they need to be concerned with, what they need to focus on in their own ministries, even to our day. The churches, though, are facing false doctrine. And this applies particularly to 1 Timothy and to Titus. There are, on the one hand, things that are believed that need to be corrected, what we might call Jewish myths and endless genealogies from the very language of the letters. And on the other hand, there is a wrongful practice of ethics that needs to be corrected. How does Paul go about writing in answer to these issues? This is something we will come to in a moment. As to structure of these letters, I'll just suggest a way of structuring the letters in this slide and the next two. But one thing is certain, that it is difficult to outline these letters. They just are presented in such different ways from Paul's other letters. The most difficult is 2 Timothy. So what seems to happen is that a topic is addressed, and then there seems to be a side comment, and then you come back to the topic at times. Now that's not always true, and some passages are fairly clearly laid out. We have a very clear beginning with the first two verses as a typical letter, the address. And then we have Timothy's role in Ephesus brought up. That is also characteristic of Titus. And then we have a section that I've decided to pull together, the 15 verses of chapter 2, and call it the quiet and peaceable lives. We'll be talking about that as a separate subject. But the challenge here is not to separate out what is said about women in verses 9 through 15 from the rest of the chapter. I would say that what Paul has in view here, the primary issue he has, is how can Christians lead quiet and peaceable lives? And he has a word to all of them, he has a word to the men, and he has a word to the women, or about the women. And then he turns very clearly to the issue of overseers and deacons in chapter 3, and then talks about the error of the false teachers and Timothy's teaching in chapter 4. Chapter 5, I call the church family, although most of chapter 5 is about widows, and it goes into chapter 6 where a word is spoken to slaves, and the last few verses, it seems to me, might just possibly still relate to this section. This is one of the places I have trouble outlining the letter. But clearly in chapter 6, verse 6, the topic of money comes up. Within this section, there's another aside, but then Paul comes back to deal with the role of money. This is another issue we will look at later on. And then there's a very brief personal conclusion addressed to Timothy. Titus seems to have this structure: a salutation, first 4 verses. As with 1 Timothy, a word about Titus's role in Crete. Although in chapter 1, Paul jumps right into the task of Titus appointing overseers or elders. And that is a topic that only comes up in chapter 3 in 1 Timothy. So there's the same material, but Titus's role here is primarily a role of appointment of people like that in the church. Then there is a section that I call Titus's teaching to the church family. And that's because different groups are mentioned in the church: older men, older women, and so forth. We'll come back to that topic. Then we have the grace of God in 2:11 through 3:8. This is a more theological reflection on Paul's part. What I haven't emphasized in my outlines is the theological paragraph here and there in all of the letters. But it's not just a matter of practical advice about this and that, or even ethical advice about this and that, but there's a lot of theology in these pastoral epistles. Then we have controversies in chapter 3, 9 through 11. It's just a few verses. It seemed like it deserved a separate place, though, unless it's another aside. And then we have a conclusion in 3:12 through 15. In 2 Timothy, as I said, we have a more difficult time of outlining this particular letter. We have a salutation. We do have a prayer section here in this case, unlike in 1 Timothy and Titus. Then we have Timothy's ministry and Paul's mention. That was something that we found in all 3 of the pastoral letters. Some kind of word about ministry right at the beginning. And then we have general words to Timothy. Now notice I've taken that from 2:1 to 4:5. Possibly we should break that down further. And then a word about Paul's situation, which is where we really learn that he's facing death and who has left him and his emotional state. And then we have a brief conclusion. Now, what issues are there in these letters? And we'll begin with the Cretan problem, which is the problem that Titus is facing. Titus 1:12 reads this way: Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons. And that's a quote from a well-known ancient prophetic voice from the past for the Greeks. Somewhere between 630 and 500 BC, the person named Epimenides. That's why I say it's difficult to believe that the church is reading over the shoulder of Titus, something like that. And then Paul goes on, and the previous 2 verses read this way: There are also many rebellious people, idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for sordid gain what is not right to teach. So we have two problems here in these three verses. We have the problem of the Cretans themselves and their character, and we have the problem of Jewish people in Crete and what they are teaching. Now, some references on this slide to other primary sources about the Cretans is rather enlightening. Callimachus says, "Cretans are always liars. For a tomb, O Lord, Cretans build for you, but you did not die, for you are forever." What he's referring to is the idea that the Cretans had actually built a tomb for the god Zeus. And Callimachus says, Zeus isn't dead, he's God. And so he's tying the saying that seems to have been around since Epimenides, that Cretans are always liars, to this particular issue of the tomb for Zeus. The word kretidzein means to Cretanize, and that was used to refer to lying and cheating. Kretidzein pros Kreta was a phrase that can be translated to Cretanize against a Cretan, or to match lies with lies. Cretans are liars. Cretans are also called gluttons. We see that in Hesiod. We hear about them wanting money, and Cicero says that Cretans think highway robbery honorable. So Cretans come out with a very low reputation in a number of authors from antiquity, as Paul reflects. So there is a false teaching. And one thing that we can say about this false teaching in the pastoral epistles in general, particularly 1 Timothy and Titus, is that the false teaching involves misleading speech. Just let's read through these passages that I've accumulated here from all three of the pastoral epistles. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teaching of demons, through the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences are seared with a hot iron. While he's talking about later times, he doesn't mean times in the future, but he means we are living in the later times, and this is what's going on in the church. Timothy, you're facing this. 1 Timothy 6:20 through 21 reads this way: "Avoid the profane chatter and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. By professing it, some have missed the mark as regards the faith." And then in 2 Timothy chapter 2, 16 to 18 we read, "Avoid profane chatter." Again, the same language from 1 Timothy 6. "For it will lead people into more and more impiety, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth by proclaiming that the resurrection has already taken place. They are upsetting the faith of some." Here is the only place that we realize that some content of the false teaching is that the resurrection has already taken place. We're going to see some other passages that show us some of the other content of the false teaching. But in actual fact, most of what Paul says about the misleading speech is the way to handle it isn't necessarily to, well, let's put it this way. Paul himself doesn't address the specific errors of the false speech, but rather gives Timothy and Titus a way of handling false speech in general. And that comes through their proclaiming the truth, and also by appointing overseers and deacons or elders in the church, who will also have, the elders or overseers will also have teaching responsibilities. And this will shore up the church against the false teaching. 2 Timothy 4:3 reads, "For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but have itching ears. They will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires." And then in Titus 1:10 through 11, "There are also many rebellious people, idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision." We read this passage earlier. "They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for sordid gain what is not right to teach." And what we realize in verse 11 is that not only are they teaching false things, but they're getting money for doing so. People are paying them as they would pay Greek orators. There's also, as we noted earlier, a Jewish problem in these letters. And Paul uses the language of myths and genealogies in relationship to the Jewish teaching. 1 Timothy 1:4, "And not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculations rather than the divine training that is known by faith." Paul doesn't actually give us content of these myths and endless genealogies. We'll try to look at what that might be in a moment, but here let's note again that Paul is concerned about how to stop this sort of thing rather than to answer the falseness of it per se. Titus 1:14, "Not paying attention to Jewish myths or to commandments of those who reject the truth." Titus 3:9, "Avoid stupid controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless." So there we get the idea that the law is involved. This is a Jewish issue here. But again, Paul's main concern is just let's not get involved in this anymore. Let's put it aside. Let's end it. And let's move on to what is important, what is profitable, and what is of worth in teaching in the church. 2 Timothy 4:3 through 4, "For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, having itching ears, they'll accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths." Okay, so we read verse 3 earlier. Here we have the language of myths again in verse 4. 1 Timothy 1:7, "Desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they're saying or the things about which they make assertions." So it's not just myths and endless genealogies, but the law is packaged in this, and it's a Jewish problem. As Titus 1:10 also mentions, the problem is especially with those of the circumcision. So could we say something more about these Jewish myths and genealogies? Genealogies came to include all the early tales adherent to the births of founders, says F.H.A. Hort in his work Judaistic Christianity, written over a century ago. We could look at Polybius, Thucydides, and Diodorus Siculus, for example. The latter, Diodorus Siculus, says, "Those who compile the narratives of ancient mythology labor under many disadvantages in their composition. The variety and the multitude of the heroes, demigods, and men in general, whose genealogies must be set down, make their recital a difficult thing to achieve. But the greatest and most disconcerting obstacle of all consists in the fact that those who have recorded the deeds and myths of the earliest times are in disagreement among themselves." What Diodorus Siculus actually does is he intends and accomplishes writing what different peoples in the Roman Empire believed about genealogies and myths. He compiles a book along those lines. The myths of various peoples are included in his work, including the Cretans, for that matter. And the stories are precisely what myths are: speculative details from prehistoric times about gods and their origins, and about ancient peoples. and their relationship to the founding of the peoples. Genealogies are related to that, but on the other hand have to do with the history that is focused on persons, as opposed to history that is focused on places, dates, and events. The Greco-Roman world appears engrossed in myths, legends, stories of heroes and their genealogies, and the like. These myths had a real significance for people who were worried about offending this god or that god, anxious about fate, inquiring into the future through oracles, dabbling in magic, and so forth. What Paul appears to be concerned about is a syncretistic Judaism in these regions outside of Israel, a Judaism that tried to cast faith in like terms as their Gentile neighbors. If that is how the Gentiles talk about their religions, where Dionysius was born, for example, and allegedly he was born in Crete, then the Jews are trying to come up with stories to match. Now, the error in Colossae might be quite instructive for us to get a handle on what's going on here in the Pastoral Epistles. The error in Colossae would be of the same sort, where believers gave in to concerns about thrones, rulers, authorities, and dominions, and the view that these require certain behaviors from the people: do not taste, do not touch, and so on. There too the error had a Jewish dimension, as we saw in the lecture on Colossians. This sort of Jewish diaspora thinking, no doubt, entered the early church as well, and it did so in Asia and in Crete in particular. Paul is drawing a distinction between this understanding of religion and the gospel that Titus and Timothy are to proclaim. Perhaps our parallels today would be when Christians get overly speculative about the origins of the world. Yes, God created it, but do we really have to make divisions in our focus on trying to figure out when the world began and what took place, and try to put into Christian perspective where the dinosaurs fit in and so forth? Or on the other hand, and perhaps this is more appropriate, discussion about end time theories. This is how Christ is going to come back. This is how long he's going to rule. He doesn't come back now, he comes back then. Here's the rapture, or whatever we talk about. That kind of speculation sometimes divides people, keeps people from preaching in their denominations, and just seems to be, as Paul would say, something that contributes absolutely nothing to godliness. 1 Timothy 4:7, have nothing to do with profane myths and old wives' tales. Train yourself in godliness. There is the focus of the Christian life and thought that Paul puts before the churches in these pastoral epistles, and it is a word on target for us today. So we see that one of Paul's concerns is about the divisions that this kind of speculation about myths and genealogies create. Titus 1:11, they must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for sordid gain what is not right to teach. There's the problem of upsetting whole families, the divisions that are caused. There's another issue, the issue of food, that reminds us of possibly food laws in Judaism. Now, what we're about to read is clearly not entirely a Jewish issue. So could the food debate be a debate about food sacrifice to idols as well as Jewish food laws? We don't have a particular answer to that question. What we read in 1 Timothy 4:1-5 is this. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons, through the hypocrisy of liars whose consciences are seared with a hot iron. They forbid marriage and demand abstinence from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. That sounds very much like what we read in Acts when Peter sees the sheet come down with unclean foods. And don't call unclean what God has called clean, what God has created. Verse 4, for everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected, provided it is received with thanksgiving, for it is sanctified by God's word and by prayer. Related to the problem in 1 Timothy 4 that mentions food is the issue of forbidding marriage. And so we see that there is an issue regarding marriage. The famous passage of 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15, that talks about women being silent, ends in verse 15 with these words, yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. The she in 1 Timothy 2:15 is actually Eve, who has been referenced in the previous verses. She will be saved through childbearing. It's referring back to the curse and yet the hope that comes in Genesis 3 for Adam and Eve. And the mention of childbearing here seems quite appropriate given the forbidding of marriage by the false teachers. 1 Timothy 5 verses 14 to 15 is dealing with widows and whether what kind of widows should be put onto the order of widows in the church. Paul's point is, put the older widows on, not the younger widows. He says, so I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households, so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. For some have already turned away to follow Satan. You don't have a person take a pledge that they can't keep. That's his concern. And if some people are forbidding marriage, and some widows are saying, all right, I'm not going to marry, but they're young, then they desire to get married again later, and they fall, they go against what they have pledged in being put on the order of widows. But possibly, quite likely, more is going on here as well, that they are succumbing to the temptation, and that is why Paul uses such strong language here. They have turned away to follow Satan. Now, the situation of women is not just whether or not they marry and bear children, but it's also connected to the misleading speech that we have addressed before. 1 Timothy 5:13, they learn to be idle, these women who are on the order of widows but not married and don't have children. They learn to be idle, gadding about from house to house. And they are not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. This too could be what's going on about their turning away to Satan. 1 Timothy 2:11 through 14, Paul says, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Notice that Paul has three things, he says in verse 12, that he will not permit. The woman to teach, to have authority over man, and to keep silent, thirdly. And then he has two reasons for that. The reason of who was formed first, and then who was deceived. And it seems to me that we have what's called a chiasm, because it's in the shape of an X, the Greek letter chi. And that's represented here by me in this passage. What stands at the middle is she is to keep silent. But the reasons of the other two items in verse 12 are related to the two reasons in verse 13, as shown. So, not permitting a woman to teach is related to the deception in verse 14. And not permitting a woman to have authority over a man is related to who was formed first. So the ideas of of the woman teaching and the woman having authority over a man are two separate ideas. They are related, they overlap, but they aren't exactly the same. And so we need to ask then whether a woman not teaching is not narratively related to the deception that we see in the story of Adam and Eve. In other words, it's not that women were created that way so that they cannot teach and are just naturally, by the way they were created, given over to deception. Paul is not saying that God created women, that they're creatures who are deceived, but rather in the narrative, the woman Eve was deceived. And so that functions as an analogy, not a creation statement, but as an analogy that women should not teach. The second item here is that a woman should not have authority over a man because God didn't create the woman in such a way that she has authority over man. Rather, he created Adam first and then Eve. So Paul does seem to have a sense of authority. The man has the authority. But it is a separate idea from this idea of teaching here. And particularly, the woman teaching is related to the problem in the church of misleading speech and false teaching. And then when Paul says in verse 12, the middle term here in this chiastic structure, she is to keep silent, he says exactly what he has said in the beginning of the chapter in verse 2, that everybody is to keep silent in relationship to the society. In other words, Christians should live the quiet life. They shouldn't cause disturbance. They shouldn't be known for civil disturbance. And so Paul is finding a way to tell Timothy to keep the women from causing a disturbance within the church. The men also can cause a disturbance in the church, and that is to be found in chapter 2, verse 8. In the beginning of this section, the men can be causing a disturbance by known for arguing, but instead Paul says they should lift up their holy hands prayerfully rather than be known for their disputes. So there are three groups that need to consider how to be silent. One is all Christians in relationship to society, not being known for a disturbing minority in what they do and how they relate to society. Secondly, the men, verse 8, and then thirdly, the women in this issue of being associated with the false teaching and so asserting themselves, like the Amazon women who established Ephesus. Or the women in the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, or the women, the new women of the Roman society who are starting to act like men and not realize that they are following men into all kinds of sin by being loose women, just like the men were loose in society sexually. Or furthermore, like the cult of Sybil, the great mother cult in Asia that was so popular, where men would emasculate themselves for this goddess and serve as her priests. So Paul seems to be addressing a word for that context of saying, no, there is a difference between men and women, and the women should not, by their practices, have authority over a man. Just one more point on that in verse 12. The word for have authority is not the normal word, kuriein, but it is a special word, authentane in Greek. And while translated have authority over a man here, many interpreters of Greek here in this verse think that that word really does carry far more than just have authority over, but really have an abusive authority over a man. Now, any kind of an authority in that kind of society over a man by a woman could be seen as abusive. But the term could be used in much stronger language for harming someone in the Greek language. And although the word isn't found in the Greek text of Genesis, it may be that Paul has that in mind, that the woman has abused her authority with respect to Adam. Yes, they're both guilty, but she has led him into sin. And that is an example of the abuse of authority in Paul's view. Paul is thinking in a narrative way when he uses these two examples in verses 13 and 14. And as he continues into verse 15 and says, but she will be saved through childbirth, referring to Eve. He's thinking narratively, primarily. So it's very important to see that the misleading speech and the problem with women and whether they should marry and what happens to these young widows and all of this is the context for Paul's words in 1 Timothy 11 through 15 here. 2 Timothy 3, 6 through 7, just to finish off these examples of women and misleading speech, says this, for among them are those who make their way into households and captivate silly women, overwhelmed by their sins and swayed by all kinds of desires, who are always being instructed and never arriving at a knowledge of the truth. This is the problem that Paul has been facing, and he addresses in two different letters to Timothy. Another problem that's addressed is the problem of wealth. Paul says, pursue godliness, not wealth. And what we're going to look at is just in chapter 6 here of 1 Timothy. He says that wealth, regarding wealth, he says, be content with food and clothing. Verse 8. He says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Verse 10. He says that the rich should not be haughty or hope in their wealth. One can easily picture in a community those who are wealthy taking a self-possessed attitude over against those who aren't, even those who are slaves, or putting their hope in wealth. And then finally he says the rich should be rich in good deeds. And why is that? There's some motivation. And so store up treasure for the future. Paul has the idea here that those who do good deeds will be rewarded by God at the last judgment. We've been looking at the problems faced by this missionary team of Paul's, Timothy and Titus. And as we've looked at the problems, we've also looked at some of the solutions that Paul gives. Now let's look at some of the other answers more particularly. First of all, one of the main things that we get from the pastoral epistles is that the solution to the problem is to teach the truth. Illustrations here are from 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. Instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine. Chapter 4, verse 6. If you put these instructions before the brothers and sisters, you will be a good servant of Christ Jesus, nourished on the words of the faith and of the sound teaching that you have followed. Chapter 4, verse 11. These are the things you must insist on and teach. Chapter 6, verse 2. Teach and urge these duties. And then the next two verses. Whoever teaches otherwise and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the teaching that is in accordance with godliness, is conceited, understanding nothing, and has a morbid craving for controversy and for disputes about words. Following on, in 2 Timothy 3:14 through 4:2, we read, knowing from whom you have learned it, and how from childhood you have known the sacred writings, that would be the Old Testament, that are able to instruct you, Timothy, for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so that everyone who belongs to God may be proficient, equipped for every good work. In the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and in view of his appearing and his kingdom, I solemnly urge you, proclaim the message. Be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, and encourage with the utmost patience in teaching. In this passage we see both a reference to Scripture, which at this time would be the Old Testament, and a reference to proclaiming the message about Jesus Christ, that is, the gospel. These two things are the content of teaching that is the content of teaching that is entrusted to someone like Timothy. Out of all the responsibilities in the church, that is primary. And then we have Titus 2:1 and 15. But as for you, teach what is consistent with sound doctrine. And then declare these things, exhort and reprove with all authority. This is Paul's solution to the problems. Teach the right thing. Be sure that you're teaching the right thing. The right thing is what? The best passage to go to is 2 Timothy 3:14 to 5:4-2. The Scriptures, which we can expand to include the New Testament, although Paul could only refer to the Old Testament at this point. And then secondly, the gospel itself, the message. The second way to address the problems is to lead the quiet life. And we've already talked about this in terms of chapter 2. For kings and all who are in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. And then to the men, they should pray lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. And then to the women, learn in silence with full submission. And then the word for silence there is the same word that is quiet in chapter 2, verse 2. Reading on, though, in 1 Timothy 3:2, an overseer must be above reproach. In other words, this person too has led a quiet life and isn't the focus of contention and dispute. And then in chapter 3, verse 11, women likewise must be serious, not slanderers, but temperate, faithful in all things. The word here comes right in the middle of what is said about the deacons. And it's possible to read this as the wives of the deacons, or it's possible to read it in terms of the female deacons, since the word deacon is a male term. Perhaps the word woman is used here, but they are deacons. We know there are female deacons in the church at this time and afterwards, and so that might well be what he has in mind here. But the language here of how they are to behave is that, again, you could sum up these directions in terms of leading the quiet life. Paul's concerned that believers lead the quiet life. And that applies both to what's going on in the church with the false teaching and controversies, but also how the church is perceived by the larger society. One of the major answers to the problems that these churches are facing is met by Paul's asking Timothy and Titus to appoint overseers and deacons. And so we can look at passages in 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 13 and 5, 17 through 19, and then also in the first chapter of Titus, verses 5 through 9. Note that there is not a single leader in the church, but various people functioning together in oversight roles in the church. One distinction between overseers and deacons seems to be that the former might also have the task of teaching and preaching. And if they do, Paul suggests that they be paid. 1 Timothy 5:17. The word elders also appears in 1 Timothy and Titus, but doesn't seem to be, as I said earlier, a separate role from the overseer. The word elder also is found throughout the Old Testament and applies also to people who are considered elders in the Jewish synagogue. And Paul and Barnabas, Luke tells us, appointed elders in the church that they established on their first missionary journey, Acts 14:23. In Paul's letter to the Philippian church, he greets the overseers and deacons, Philippians 1:1. Thus the church followed the model of the synagogue from earliest times, contrary to the views of some that say the church began as some sort of a charismatic group that later developed roles of oversight. By the time of the second century A.D., we do know there is a new role that has developed, and it is the role of the bishop. We learn this as we read the writings of Ignatius, who writes possibly as early as 108, or possibly as late as 117-18, somewhere in that period. He is a bishop on his way to martyrdom in Rome, and he writes a number of letters, the letters of Ignatius. In them, he mentions the bishop, singular, and he himself is the bishop of Antioch. So a new role, a singular bishop, separate from the language of overseers, plural, in the local church, is now something that has been established. A third point I wanted to make is that the situation is in the pastoral epistles involves Paul having authority in the churches, and Timothy and Titus, as part of the Pauline mission team, also have authority. But within the local church, there is a group that oversees people and tasks, not a single person. And they're to appoint these people as they move on. They're not to replace themselves with a single person in authority. Also, the qualifications for overseers and deacons or elders are associated with the tasks that they need to do. Since they're chosen on the basis of their performance, they must have already been functioning somewhat in those roles, and their recognition as overseers and deacons was an internal affirmation of persons in the church, not an appointment of someone to a new place of ministry. In other words, you weren't given a title like reverend and you might move from one church to the other. No, it was the church itself, internally, that recognized your functioning in that way and gave an official recognition to it. Finally, then, this does not seem to be ordination in the sense of being recognized as holding an office within a clergy. They are recognized as... The problem with women in the church has a particular side to it as we come to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And in verses 3 through 16, Paul addresses the idea of an order of widows. He says, first of all, nobody should put on the order if they have family to take care of them. And he says it's a matter of extreme importance that families do take care of their own elderly women. But the church can take on that role. The church is an extension of the family. Churches met in homes. People in the churches called each other brothers and sisters. And there is a sense in which the church is itself a family. Now, the order of widows was to be for widows who have led a good life. They meet certain requirements. They have been married only once. They're 60 years old. And Paul's actually concerned that younger widows not be put onto the order of widows, as we looked at earlier. So what we see here is Paul having a concern for the poor. Just as we read back in Galatians 2:10, the church said, make sure that your gospel includes a concern for the poor. And here we have a different kind of answer of Paul's, not taking up a collection from his Gentile churches for the poor in Jerusalem, but here actually establishing something within the local community for the widows. The church was known for this in the early years of the church, in the patristic period. It was known for its hospitals, for its old age homes, for its care for the poor, including care for the widows. And in this way, the church really revolutionized society. Recently, we reached a point where the church gave over its starting of schools, its having nursing homes, its having boarding schools, its having hospitals and so forth to private entities or to the government. And now we're faced with a situation in the West where the church has lost its authority in society and is even marginalized through laws. And it raises questions about whether or not we can simply count on government programs to meet the needs that the church used to meet and establish these institutions to meet. Once again, it seems as if we're being challenged to come back to the scriptures and rethink what is it going to mean to care for the elderly in our church, and not just assume that Medicaid and Medicare or national health care or whatever it is will take care of them. So here's a challenge to us to rethink this in our day as an answer to the problems in the church that Paul is facing. This is one of the key things that he says in 1 Timothy 5. Now he also has a word about the different people in the church having certain virtues that they show. And we might call this a role ethic in the church. And we find it in both 1 Timothy and in Titus. It's more neatly packaged in Titus in chapter 2, 1 through 10. There's a word for the older men, several things are said. A word for the older women, several things are said. For the younger women, Paul only says one thing for the younger men. They should learn how to control themselves. And then he has a word for the slaves. In 1 Timothy, we have the movement from chapter 5:1 through chapter 6:2 through the groups of older men, older women, younger women, widows, which is the expanded section. But then he comes back to talk about elders in the church, and here we don't have overseers and deacons, but just elders mentioned, and then slaves mentioned in 6:1 through 2. So this is our concluding point as one of the answers that Paul has for the church. In addition to the other things that we've gone over, he says, and here are the virtues for the different groups within the church. Not everyone has the same virtues, but there are different virtues for the different groups to focus on and to preach. And so here we have then 3 letters of Paul written most likely in the 60s, very likely after 62, that capture these new concerns that have come up, but concerns that have their similarities back in the letter to the Colossian church. And Paul answers how to handle these problems for his missionary team of Timothy and Titus.